Go, Francesca.
Welcome, OTTOLINATV. Today we have the honor to host Grace Blakeley, who is a staff writer at Freedom magazine and author of several books. Her last book, VULTURE Capitalism, will define a galvanizing takedown of neoliberalism, free market logic by Naomi Klein, and a must-read for anyone keen to put the demos, so the people in Greek, in democracy by Yanis Varoufakis. So welcome, Grace, to be here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Welcome, Grace. Welcome to OTTOLINATV.
So let's start from the very beginning. What is this book about, and why did you decide to write it?
Yeah, thank you. So the book is really about kind of taking apart this mainstream view that we have, that capitalism is a free market system. And it's one based on a kind of separation between politics and economics, between markets and states. And a lot of your listeners might know about the kind of neoliberal turn in the 1980s, so the kind of free market turn, where you had the election of leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And they argued that their project was to kind of shrink the state and create free markets. And what I show in the book is that that project actually wasn't what it was set out to be. So we didn't get a smaller state and we didn't get freer markets. Instead, after kind of 40, 50 years of neoliberalism, we have a state that's very big for some. So there's lots of support for big businesses, for banks. There's a lot of use of state power to undermine unions, to undermine protesters and demonstrations. And yet, when it comes to supporting workers, when it comes to providing public services, when it comes to investing, the state is very small. So it's not that we've seen the state shrink, it's that we've seen it be reoriented towards supporting some groups, i.e. the powerful, and withdrawing support for other groups. And the same thing can be said about this idea of a free market economy. So, you know, the neoliberals said that they wanted to create free markets, but instead we have markets dominated by massive multinational corporations that have very little competition and that don't abide by the rules of the free market and instead actually undermine competition, raise prices, buy up their competitors, and generally exercise a lot of market power, and often work with governments to actually expand their power and promote their power. And I think this shows you a little bit about what capitalism actually is. So it's not a system based on free markets and a small state. And this is often something people believed because there was the US versus the USSR. So it was democratic free market capitalism versus centrally planned state socialism. And the idea was that, you know, if you had more state, you had more socialism, and if you had less state, you had more capitalism. But that doesn't really apply today. That's not really how capitalism works, because you have kind of big state capitalism with not particularly free markets. And the example I like to use to show how this works is the example of Boeing. So your listeners might be familiar with the 737 MAX disasters, where 2 Boeing planes fell out of the sky, killing nearly 350 people. That was something that took place in the context of a highly monopolistic market. So Boeing is a massive multinational corporation with only one major competitor, and with cooperation and support for Boeing from the US state. So Boeing has lots of government contracts. It receives corporate welfare, so tax breaks and subsidies from the government. And the regulator had moved to a philosophy of self-regulation, which is how the banks were regulated before the financial crisis. And this was basically the idea that these businesses would regulate themselves. So Boeing basically decided, we're going to put profits above everything else. We're going to denigrate our engineers. We're going to cut costs, undermine our unions, and we're going to regulate ourselves, which means they weren't really going to do anything. And it later transpired that senior managers at Boeing had known about the problems with these planes before they went to market, but did nothing about it. And then even after these disasters happened, Boeing was still receiving a huge amount of support from the government. So this kind of shows that capitalism isn't a free market system, and that more often than not, governments are actually working to support and promote the interests of big businesses rather than kind of regulating them and constraining them.
Clear. could we say, in your opinion, Grace, that we in the West we always lived in the last 70 years in a mixed system in which capitalism and democracy and social system lived together also during the Cold War. The problem with the last 30 years of neoliberal system is that the capitalistic part of our society take always more advantage on the other dimension, democratic and social dimension of Western societies. And I think that's always more clear also in Europe, where our welfare system and social system was stronger than in America. But in the last 30 years, we started thinking that in the name of free market, we should in some way deconstruct our welfare system and social state to give more freedom, but to give more freedom in reality to capitalism. And so I was wondering if you agree with this idea.
Yeah, so I think that is true in the sense that the kinds of political systems that we have tend to reflect the balance of power within society. So my book is a kind of it's a Marxist understanding of capitalism, which means that I analyze the nature of the system by looking at the balance of power between workers and bosses. And so there are certain times in which you have a more equal balance of power between these two groups. So, you know, in the post-war period, for example, workers were much better organized all over the world, really, but particularly in Europe. So they had strong unions. They were very able to influence political parties and kind of make their demands known and organize and campaign. But that really changed during the neoliberal period for a lot of different reasons that I look at in the book. And it meant that workers were basically kind of excluded from the exercise of state power, and their interests were less likely to be recognized in the formulation of policy. And instead, we had this system that was based on just kind of bosses and politicians working to get what. So my book really looks at this idea of like capitalist planning. And the argument is that, you know, far from having this like free market versus capitalist system, you actually have a lot of planning that takes place within all capitalist economies across the whole of history. But the major question is who gets to influence the kinds of decisions that are being made. So in the post-war period, because workers were really well organized, they were better able to influence what was going on in the state. They were better able to kind of hold their bosses to account and like make demands on their own account. With the shift to neoliberalism, it wasn't that that planning became less significant, but it was that workers got pushed out of that process. So it became just governments and big businesses basically that were making all the decisions on everyone else's behalf. And that's the kind of society we live in today, right? It's one in which unions have been crushed, in which governments all around the world are trying to repress protest and really kind of undermine democracy because they want to be able to maintain control among this small elite, which is basically, you know, business groups, lobbyists, financial institutions, all of whom have a really significant ability to influence what the government is doing. But ordinary people really struggle to kind of get into those halls of power and to make demands on their own account. And there are lots of examples of how this works in the book. I think a really good example is fossil fuels, right? So we all know that we need to decarbonize. We all know that we kind of live in, at the moment, a pretty unsustainable economy. But because of the massive influence of the fossil fuel companies over our governments, we've still got massive amounts of subsidies going to those companies and not enough action being taken to kind of counter climate breakdown. So the great example of this is ExxonMobil in the US, right? ExxonMobil's climate scientists knew about climate breakdown in the 1970s Their climate scientists have been researching it. So what did they do in response? They took funding out of their climate research team and used that funding to promote climate denialism, basically to fund groups that were saying climate change doesn't exist, and to lobby the US government not to take any action on climate change. And that's continued to this day. So ExxonMobil lobbyists were caught on camera by Greenpeace reporters saying that they had been really successfully lobbying both Republican and Democratic politicians not to take any action on climate breakdown, and that they'd won lots and lots of wins for the company through that process. So even though the vast majority of people want to see action on climate breakdown, even though people vote for politicians like Biden on the basis that they're going to do something about climate breakdown, because the fossil fuel companies have such a massive influence on what's going on within the state, their voice doesn't get heard, right? So what happens within these institutions, it varies from country to country. And that's because the power of workers relative to bosses varies from country to country. So in the US, it's very unequal. You have massive corporations with huge amounts of power, so much money spent on lobbying politicians, and then relatively weaker unions and civil society organizations. In Europe, the picture's a bit different because you don't have as many and as powerful large corporations as you do in America, and organized labor is a bit more powerful. So you get more social democracy, right? You see how this works. It's like the ability of workers to organize and of civil society to organize comes to influence the kinds of political institutions that we get. So if we want to change politics, you have to start by getting organized and by demanding that politicians actually do what you want. I like to say that politicians should be as scared of the people voting for them as they are of the people giving them the money.
Yes. Of course. We always say that the biggest myth of our time is thinking that capitalism and democracy are in some way compatible with each other, when it's so clear that capitalism is an oligarchic, is a natural oligarchic economic system. So it's they don't agree a lot. And I wanted to quote you because you write in your book that there is a deep contradiction between the belief that we are free and the reality of living under capitalism. So a system of pervasive unfreedom. What do you mean by a system of pervasive unfreedom?
Yeah, so I like to use this term unfreedom to contrast with what we were promised with the kind of free market turn. So this is idea that if you live in a free market society, then you're free to consume what you want, to work where you want, to kind of make decisions about your life. And this is seen as kind of the ultimate indication of whether or not you're free. It's a very individualistic understanding of what it means to be free. But what you find when you look at actually existing capitalist societies is that people aren't free in that sense. And there are also loads of other constraints on their behavior. So even in the very limited individualistic sense of freedom today, being free to choose what you consume, for example. If you go into the supermarket, you have the choice of all these different brands, except when you look on the back, you see that they're all owned by about 4 or 5 different companies. So there isn't really even consumer choice. There's not as much consumer choice as we expect. Equally, this idea that you're free to choose where you work. Well, actually, if you live in a small town where, say, the only major employer is a massive Amazon warehouse, you don't have a lot of choice as to where you work. You know, it's get a job or starve, basically, because the government isn't going to support you if you can't work. And so Amazon, in that context, has the capacity to determine wages, working conditions, labor rights, etc., because it's the only major employer in that area. So it has so much market power. So the kind of monopolization of markets means that even that very limited understanding of freedom isn't met within capitalist societies. But there's also this other layer behind that, which is actually even more important. So you can say you're free to the extent that you are free to choose where you work and what you buy and all these different sorts of things. But that doesn't account for the choices that you face. So, who gets to decide what goods are on the shelves? who gets to decide what job opportunities there are, who gets to decide what the wages are, who gets to decide which major politicians you're choosing between when you go to vote at the elections. It's like, how are the frameworks within which you're making these decisions, how are they determined? And that all comes back to who gets to make decisions about the structure of society, who gets to decide regulation, labor rights, wages, the size of big corporations, the kind of carbon intensity of our economies. All these are kind of big decisions that ordinary people in the day to day don't really have an influence over. We're told, oh, you get to vote once every 4 years, basically, and that's your opportunity to kind of influence these factors. But you don't get to decide the manifestos of the parties. You don't get to decide the politicians who are being put to the electorate. And so you have a very limited freedom to influence the conditions of your existence, to influence the structure of society. And that, I think, is what unfreedom comes down to. My argument is that if we want real freedom, people need to have individual freedom rights. They need to have, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, all of these important things. But they also need to be free to determine the way that society works. Now, what would that look like? That means a thorough democratization of all of our social and political institutions. So it means, as a worker, you get to influence how your firm invests. You get to influence, whether or not your firm is carbon neutral. You get to make decisions about how that firm works. That's worker democracy. That's democracy within the firm. Equally, if you're in a community, you should be able to make decisions about what goes on in that community. You should be able to influence how your local budget is being spent. You should get to have a say over how your public services work. And at the national level, you should have a significant input into policy making, into how political parties work, into things like how investment is undertaken. And I have lots of ideas in the book that show how we could kind of democratize decision making so that at every level, at your workplace, in your community, at the national level, even internationally, how people can actually come together and have a say over how society works. And that, I think, is the only way we get to true freedom. Because, you see right now lots of people very angry about capitalism, angry about inequality, angry about climate breakdown, but they feel powerless because they're like, how do I influence these systems? They're so big and they're so beyond me. And they seem to be controlled by, a very small number of people. So to really have a free society, all of us need to feel empowered to actually influence how that society works.
Okay. Yeah. If there is this song in Italy that says, freedom, real freedom is not a free place, but is a participation. That's freedom. That's
exactly.
You mentioned in the book Hayek and Keynes and Marx. So can you explain the differences about them? Because not only people, I think, don't know very much about them, but there is this conviction that actually mainstream economy is science. It's not a theory, it's science. So if you tell people that there are alternatives, they look at you like, I don't know, you're trying to explain cancer, saying that it's not a proliferation of cells, but is it an imbalance of humors and something like that. You're trying to explain, disease with Galenic theories. But this is not the case, because economy is more about movements of goods and movements of money. So it's about the will of people. It's not a natural phenomenon like disease or physiology or So can you explain that to our followers?
Absolutely. I think you explained that really well, actually. It's completely true. The way that economists have tried to turn economics into a science is an ideological move. It's a political move because it means that you're less likely to question the judgments of economists and politicians and decision makers because they say this is the truth, this is science, right? And the way that they do that is by analyzing the economy from a very abstract level. So you look at numbers on a screen, abstract movements, flows of money, profits and losses, wages, inflation, just numbers everywhere. And when you take these numbers, you put them into an economic model and you say, right, this is, how the economy works. We need a little bit more of this there. We need a little bit more of that there. And that's a whole view of the system almost. The issue is that those numbers relate to relationships and processes that are human and that are political. So when you think about the data on, let's say, wages and inflation, for example, you can say inflation is rising by 3% a year. That means we need to increase interest rates in order to keep inflation down. That seems like an objective argument. It seems like that's scientific. But what are you actually saying there? Well, if you go to the human processes that underpin that kind of observation, what they're really saying is we need to increase unemployment because inflation is rising, which means that workers are getting pay increases, let's say. And when workers are getting pay increases, that potentially erodes the profits of big businesses. So we, as the kind of governors of this economy, need to make credit more expensive, which is going to make it harder for businesses to invest, harder for them to employ people, and increase unemployment and reduce workers' bargaining power. Now, when you explain it that way, it sounds very political. It doesn't sound scientific at all. It is people making decisions about everyone else's lives, about the future of the economy. But when you just explain it using numbers and technical economic terms, all of that politics is stripped out. And this actually goes back to, the very origins of capitalism. So people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, they were these kind of free market economists who studied capitalism from this market perspective. And they, by studying markets, said that capitalism is this really efficient system. It's going to make everyone better off. And we should all kind of, abide by this free market system. Marx came in and said, you guys are just studying markets. I want to know where the stuff we're trading in these markets comes from. So he said we had to move from the market to the hidden abode of production. And so we had to look inside the corporation to really understand capitalism and how it works. And when you do that, you see that capitalism is this system that is based on the social division of labor. So the fact that some people own everything and they get to make decisions about how those resources are used. And then everyone else is forced to sell their labor power for a living. And they have much less freedom to be able to kind of decide how the system works and even their own kind of working conditions. And that is a much more political way of understanding capitalism. Marx wasn't an economist. His book, Capital, was entitled A Critique of Political Economy. So like a critique of the whole idea of economics. Because he was saying, you can't just study these abstract systems. You have to look at the relationships, the social relationships and processes that underpin these abstract movements of money. And all major economists, really most major economists, to a greater or lesser extent, adopt this very abstract view to try to depoliticize economics. The neoliberals do this a lot. So they say, they kind of build very abstract economic models and they say, we have decided that if you cut taxes, it increases economic growth over the long run. What they don't say is that, it increases economic growth by sucking money up to those at the very top who then, pump that money into financial markets or, spend it on luxury goods. So, all the gains accrue at the top. It's not an equal growth. So they kind of view the economy in quite abstract terms and use it to make very ideological arguments because they have significant control over economics departments. Neoliberalism and actually more generally neoclassical economics is the de facto way of understanding the economy. But even Keynesians have a slightly more political view of how the economy works. They do study institutions. But even Keynes developed this, less mathematical, but still relatively abstract way of understanding the economy that kind of it focuses on what politicians can do to make markets work more effectively, right? Rather than questioning the politics that underpins this whole system. So the Marxist view is like, no, we're not taking anything for granted. We're not looking at the economy as an abstract set of equations. We're looking at the economy as social relationships and processes that underpin those social relationships and asking, are those relationships fair? What are the power dynamics that underpin those relationships? And what are the kind of economic and political dynamics that emerge from those relationships? And that is the point at which you start saying, oh, we don't just need, politicians to control the market or regulate the market. We need to change those social relationships upon which this system is based. So we need to make sure everyone gets a say in production, everyone gets a say in politics, rather than just this small minority.
Clear. And about what you were saying, I was thinking about this kind of love that our public opinion had for this kind of technical government, as we called in Italy, before with starting with Mario Monti and then with Mario Draghi. And also our left public opinion were saying, yes, finally, we get, now we are free from all the parties, and now we have the true competent people that know how economy works, because of course economy is a science, so they know how it works, and they can do, of course, the best for us, because it's their goal, of course. And it's a bit how it worked. And during especially our first technical government, Mario Monti, we saw lots of cuts and destruction of our welfare states, and a lot of unpopular politics that other parties couldn't do, because but now Monti can, because he's a technical who know how economy works, and it's I think it's the perfect example of what you were saying. And I want also to ask you, because before we were talking about the importance of participations, and I think it's linked with the importance of the national state. That's one of the political concept and category that in the last 30 years suffer a lot in this rhetoric of globalization and internationalization. I wanted to know if I wanted to ask you if do you also think that national state, national sovereignty is today a very important dimension of democracy that we should in some way go in more in that direction than before? What do you think about it?
Yeah, so in the book, I have a whole chapter looking at the nature of the state and state power. And it draws on the work of a very famous Italian Marxist called Antonio Gramsci, who you may be familiar with. And Gramsci's view of the state was kind of more nuanced, I suppose, than the original Marxist view. So Marx in the Communist Manifesto says the state is nothing but a committee for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie, i.e. governments just do what capitalists tell them to do. Gramsci develops this view of the state, which analyzes it as a kind of social relationship, much as capital is a kind of social relationship between bosses and workers. Gramsci looks at the state as these relationships between kind of politicians, capitalists, civil society actors as well. And he looks at how the state comes to kind of dominate a lot of what goes on within civil society. And through kind of disagreements and debates that take place within the state and within civil society between more or less powerful social groups, you end up seeing the groups that are most powerful within society being the groups that get to determine what goes on within the state. So business organizations, lobbyists, financial institutions, all of these groups have a lot of power in society, and they're able to translate that social power into a power over politics and law and legislation. And what this means is that the capitalist state ends up, not always acting as a brake on the power of capitalists, not always kind of protecting workers, but often actually protecting capitalists and protecting bosses. But this is nuanced, right? Because of what I've already said. So it's all about the balance of power within society. So if workers are much more powerful within society, then they get to have more power within the state. And what you were talking about there, that shift towards globalization, which is, the mobility of capital, basically. It's been the ability of money and big businesses to kind of move all around the world, whilst workers have been fixed in place. So workers haven't been able to move, but bosses and companies have been able to move. That has resulted in a big shift in the balance of power between bosses and workers. So it means that workers are less powerful because they can't move around, but bosses and big businesses are much more powerful because they can move around. For example, if you organize into a union and say we want higher wages, a big firm can just say, right, we're leaving this country and going somewhere else. Or they can just avoid tax and say we don't have any profits to pay, we're not going to pay our taxes to the government. And so this was used basically as a kind of excuse to say we can't have social democracy anymore because big businesses are too powerful. What nobody said about globalization is that globalization, again, is not just an abstract fact. It's a process. It's a political process. And it's a political process that was facilitated by governments and by international organizations that created laws and rules that made it easier for money to move around the world and harder for workers to move around the world, right? So again, you have this relationship between what's going on in society and what's going on in politics. That kind of leads us to the context we're in now, where, if you look at the global economy, there are these massive imbalances of power between workers in the poorest parts of the world that produce all of the things that we rely on, and then multinational corporations headquartered in rich countries. And I look in the book, in the chapter on empire, about how these big corporations embed their power within international institutions. So there's a really interesting case study of the oil company Chevron in Ecuador. It did this massive oil spill in Ecuador, and then the Ecuadorian government tried to get Chevron to clean up this mess, basically, and to pay for the cleanup operation. But Chevron ended up suing the Ecuadorian government, saying, we're not going to pay this, and we're suing you because you tried to make us pay. How did they do this? Through this system at the international level called the Investor State Dispute Settlement System. And what this allows, what this creates is a mechanism whereby corporations can sue governments if governments implement legislation that harms corporate profits. So, for example, the tobacco company Philip Morris tried to sue the Australian government when they introduced plain packaging on cigarettes because they said this is going to harm our profits. So this is a mechanism at the international level which increases the power of big businesses and constrains and undermines the power of particularly poor states. Often, it's big states and big businesses that are protected, and then small and poorer states that end up suffering the consequences. So all of these things are political decisions and political choices that have been made by powerful states. And those powerful states are in turn basically, making policy choices based on the interests of the most powerful groups in their society. So you end up having a global economy that is built in the interests of big businesses in the most powerful states. How do we shift that? Well, there's lots of different ways that we can think about this. So at the national level, obviously, you need to build movements that are capable of influencing state power in the rich world. So you need to have workers organizing, communities organizing, protest movements, political movements, all the stuff that we've talked about already. But there's also a very strong case for international solidarity. So that means poor countries who are exploited and oppressed within this system coming together and saying, we're fighting back against these unfair rules and norms that are being imposed upon us at the level of the global economy. And you are actually increasingly seeing that now. So what's interesting at the moment is the way that, international law is being deployed very selectively to say, target someone like Putin, and then it's not being applied to a state like Israel, right? So there are two sets of rules, set of rules for the West's allies, and then one set of rules for everyone else. But global South countries like South Africa are saying, no, rules are rules. These should be applied to everyone. So they're testing the limits of this system, and they're working together in solidarity with other countries as well to try to make this system fairer. And it's a very interesting time, because whether or not they're successful in doing that is going to test the whole structure of the global economy. And it kind of brings us back to in the 1970s and 60s, there was much more solidarity between poor states through things like the non-aligned movement, through the new international economic order. I write about this in the book. And this was an attempt by countries in what was previously called the third world. So not kind of rich capitalist countries or centrally planned socialist countries, but all the other countries to kind of come together and say, we want a global economy that is fair. Now, a lot of those governments were basically crushed by the US. So they were taken down by kind of CIA-backed coups or whatever. And that project didn't end up happening. But there's always been the potential for that movement to re-emerge. And I think you're maybe seeing the beginnings of it today.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not very easy. Also, I don't know if you know Ben Norton. Do you know?
I don't think so.
Ben Norton is a journalist that works with Michael Hudson.
Okay, yes. Yeah. I know who you're talking about, yeah.
Okay. So when he came here, he said, it's not very easy because in this particular society, you cannot expect that a socialist party will win the election. And even if he wins, there will be something that will exclude it. Also we saw it in Spain, in France, also in England, because the Labour Party with Corbyn was a huge movement, actually.
Yeah.
So what should we do, in your opinion, to overcome these obstacles?
I'd like to add a last question, since we have just the last 5 minutes. So I also wanted to. I was wondering what is your opinion on the Chinese economic system and political system?
Yeah, so I talk a little bit about China in the book, and actually, we're taught to believe that the Chinese system is kind of the opposite of the American system, right? That you have like free market American capitalism and then kind of centrally planned Chinese communism. Actually, these systems have something in common, which is that they both rely on an element of centralized planning. So in China, you have central planning that's undertaken by bureaucrats, large, powerful businesses, and kind of municipal governments and lots of different actors within both the public and private sector, very openly working together to make policy. Whereas in the US, you have a similar set of actors. So big businesses, although big businesses play a big role, large financial institutions, politicians, bureaucrats and organizations within the state, also working together to plan who gets what. So these systems do have more in common than you might anticipate, in the sense that there's a small number of very powerful individuals and institutions that are planning what goes on in the economy. The difference is the balance of power within those different societies. So in the US, you have a very powerful capitalist class alongside a very powerful kind of political state. In China, you have a slightly less powerful capitalist class, a very powerful state bureaucracy. And then a kind of very repressed and controlled workers' movement, basically. So what both of these countries, again, have in common is that the vast majority of people have no say in what happens, or very little say in what happens within state institutions. And it kind of relates to the question that I was going to answer to Francesca, which is, how do we start to think about changing these systems? And again, it sounds a bit abstract, but it all comes down to building power, and building power from the very lowest level, from the grassroots. And the first challenge we encounter when we try to do that is individualism. So it's this idea that people see themselves as these isolated, atomized individuals who are competing against one another, whose interests are all opposed. Everything is on you. And if anything goes wrong, it's your fault. This is a very different way of understanding society than a kind of collectivist way in which we say our interests are all connected. If my boss isn't paying me a good wage, I shouldn't, push my co-workers out the way to try and get higher up the hierarchy. I should work with those people to build a movement that demands a higher wage. So individualism stops us from thinking in this way. It stops us from building political movements. It stops us from kind of demanding things of the state, because we just say, oh, I'm just going to vote once every 4 years. I'm just going to, if I want to stop climate breakdown, I'm just going to kind of reduce my carbon footprint, which was a term that was made up by the fossil fuel companies to try and promote this individualistic understanding of climate breakdown. So the first and most important question is, how do we build collective power? And that starts on a number of different levels. And it has to underpin any political project, because a lot of the political projects that you mentioned were kind of individualistic in nature. They were kind of torn between individualism and collectivism, because there was like one charismatic leader who was seen as like the savior of the whole movement. And there was less focus on building power in communities, building power in workplaces, for example. Why has the far right been so successful in a lot of places? Well, often it's been very good at building movements in communities. Remember in Greece, the far right Golden Dawn actually started, distributing food and medicines during the austerity crisis, because they saw that the best way for them to build power was to start from the ground up and build this kind of insurgent movement. Whereas the left often has focused a lot on big P electoral politics. And we've struggled a bit to kind of build power in communities and in workplaces, which is not how things were historically. Historically, we were a lot better at building power in workplaces and communities. So before we start thinking about, transforming policy, we need to be able to build power in our communities that can influence political parties that can then work within the state. And so there's lots of examples as to how to do this, and I look at them all in the book. So, community organizing. How do you do things like building community wealth building, where citizens come together and they work with local authorities to develop cooperatives that can then sell services to local government, so that you create this self-reinforcing cycle. You can build community energy companies, community land trusts, all of which kind of supports the community, supports individuals and groups within that community, supports workers, and helps to kind of build community power. There's the participatory budgeting movement, where people have a say over how money is spent at the local level. Then, of course, there's worker democracy. So I look in the book at an example of the Lucas plan, which is when a group of workers developed a plan to kind of take over their company and transform it from a weapons manufacturer to a manufacturer of socially useful technologies. And that has inspired a kind of movement for democratic worker control that continues to exist all around the world. So how can we think about doing that today, working within big organizations and with labor unions to kind of build democratic workplaces? And then there's also the question of, how do we get involved in political parties? So what pressures can we exert on the political parties that do exist, whether that's protest, whether that's kind of organizing within those parties, whether it's building groups that can put pressure on politicians, lots of different strategies that we need to think about for influencing what goes on in big P politics. But all of this relies on movement building. And the first step is thinking about how we bring non-politicized people. How do we bring them in to social movements? And often those people are crying out to be involved in these social movements because they feel lonely, they feel they don't belong, they lack a sense of community, they're isolated in these highly individualistic societies where we've lost that sense of mutuality and cooperation and care. And you can start to provide that and combat that sense of loneliness that often draws people into the far right by incorporating them into political movements, even just as small as like a campaign to save your local library. It gives you a sense of community, belonging, and it just transforms the way you look at society. So I think, big policy change is really important, but we also need to start small, particularly now when, politics, electoral politics is so challenging. How are we going to change electoral politics? Well, we're not going to be able to do that if we don't have powerful social movements that can demand change. So we really need to start doing that today.
Clear. Grace, thank you very much for this interview, for this conversation. It was very interesting. It was very clear. I recommend again everybody to read Grace's book, Vulture Capitalism, and I hope that we'll have other opportunity to talk in the future. So thank you very much again, Grace.
Thank you very much, guys. It was great chatting to you.
And bye to everybody, and we see you in the next episode. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Goodbye.